Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord. We're a group of like-minded people using John Vervaeke's work to cultivate meaning, wisdom, and communitas. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe because it really helps us with the algorithm. And if you're new to us, you'll find a link in the Discord to the Discord in the show notes. If you want to ask your own questions, you'll have to join the Discord to do so. My name is Brett, and now I'm pleased to welcome John Vervaeke here once again to answer your questions. Hey, John, how are you?
I'm good. I'm doing very well. Thank you, Brett.
Thanks for being here. Uh, we have a
My
question.
pleasure.
We have a question from Ben. Question: You said you'd like to be determined by the good and the beautiful and true, but doesn't an
Yes.
action have to be done deeply and freely in order to be good? In a phenomenous way, not autonomous way, but not heteronomous determination. How can we say of an action that it is good if there wasn't any choice of doing something else instead? You'd no longer be a finite being acting benevolently, but a puppet, an automata. Wouldn't that be a kind of having mode of the good and not the being participative mode?
Um, so let me try and parse out some of what's being asked here. Um, so what seems to be involved here is that choice in and of itself is inherent contributor to the good. That having choice is in some sense itself indicative of goodness. Um, and I guess that's where I'm concerned. Why we would consider that to be the case? I mean, there are clearly instances where the more choice we have, the more noxious the experience, the increased chance, the greater the chance of failure, the greater the chance of self-deception or foolishness. So I think equating choice and more choice with just intrinsic goodness seems a really questionable assumption. Um, and then the idea that if I choose something as opposed to needing it or wanting it, that makes my choice a better choice also seems highly questionable. We tend to regard the choices that have nothing to do with human need to be rather superficial and arbitrary. If you choose one brand of ice cream over another, when you choose somebody as your partner, you usually choose them because there's a sense in which fundamental needs are being met by that person. And in that sense, you are being determined by both their nature and your nature. Would you want to be in a relationship with somebody that was not based on their nature and your nature, but freely chosen? It doesn't seem to me like that is what most people want. In fact, they want to be as bound as they can by their nature and the other person's nature. Um, so, being puppets, uh, that uh, I mean, what is it about that metaphor that is coming to mind? The idea is we are controlled by some other agency that has intentions other than ours, and that's coercion. And I've already said that we're not talking about coercion when we talk about freedom of the will, because of course nobody should coerce us, nobody should force us, because their intentions and desires always have some sort of absolute priority over ours. And I've already said that I'm not talking about that. And so, if we don't mean that by puppet strings, if we mean instead a living organism that is really, really finely tuned to its environment, do you regard like a cat as a puppet because of how finely tuned it is to its environment? Would that justify you just killing the cat or disposing of it as you wished because it has much less uh, degrees of freedom with respect to its environment than you do? I don't regard cats as puppets. And so um, I think they have inherently valuable lives, and so I take great care to care for them when I'm in relationship with them. So again, I think there's a lot of considerations here that I'm challenging. I hope you understand that I'm challenging them in good faith. That your question is an open question, and then if you hold open the possibility that it's theonomous, the way Tillich talks about, well, that is to be determined by God, and that means determined by the true, the good, and the beautiful, and that which binds them together. That's exactly what theonomous means. It means that I'm not autonomous, in which my own proclivities and desires and even needs have an absolute authority over my action, and of course, it's not heteronomous, in which something other than me, another agent, is imposing on me. But theonomous means that, again, I am determined by what's true and good and beautiful. That's definitely what Tillich means, because of course he means the God beyond the God of theism, as he explicitly states. So both in terms of the assumptions and and also in terms of the invocation of theonomous determination, yeah, I stand by what I say. Um, and then I would add, you know, Frankfurt's, when we love something, we experience it as a voluntary necessity. We don't choose it. Um, I don't like that phrase that love is a choice. That is like love is a feeling. Love is an emotional stance that you participate in. It's not created one-sidedly by you, because that's not how love works. Um, so even when we love something, we are giving up choice with respect to it. I mean, I love my son, so I give up a lot of choice in my life because of that. That's what love is. So I'm giving you three sort of converging ways of answering your question. Um, um, I don't consider being a living being that could potentially be determined by what's true, good, and beautiful to be a puppet. What is it I'm losing? What is it? I'm losing the ability to choose to deceive myself. Great. I want to lose that ability. I want to lose that ability as completely as I possibly can. And I don't know of any moral argument you could give me why I shouldn't do that. Because the moral argument would be, no, no, John, you should keep or increase your capacity for deceiving yourself. And it's like, why and how could you possibly justify that recommendation to me? So that's my answer. I hope you take it in the spirit in which it's given.
Marco writes, "Hello, John. An appreciation for having brought many different minds to this server. Could you please explain how to use journaling in order to water one's Buddha? I am really interested in the part where you go and correct your thoughts afterwards. Thank you so much."
So there's different ways of doing this. One is, well, perhaps I was going to say, like, there's sort of a Stoic way and a Buddhist way, but they converge around the idea of, at the end of the day, examining oneself to see in which ways one has not been wise or foolish. Don't berate yourself, but counterbalance that with also remembering moments in the day. Do it in this order because the contrast works this way better. Remembering in that day when you were more mindful, when you had a relevant and important insight, when when you realized you had just broken an otherwise persistent pattern, when you opened up a real possibility in a relationship between you and another person that you might not have foreseen. Try to think of many different concrete ways in which wisdom, Buddha nature, your inner teacher, is showing up. And then note those down and celebrate them. May even start a dialogical practice which is similar to like IFS, where you talk to that part of you. I mean, people write to their diary. You can write in your journal not only the events, but you can write to that part of you. And you may get answers in whatever way you deem, you know, appropriate or, uh, you know, acceptable to you. They may be feelings. You may get a sense of propositions coming to you. You may have pictures. But you want to celebrate those moments. Remember, always begin with the ways in which you fail because you don't want to lose humility. You want to give into inflation. You want to open yourself up to real self correction. But then notice those moments, write them down, reflect on them. And then, like I say, you can even think about writing to your inner Buddha, your inner sage, thanking, thanking them if you want to personalize it more, etc. Um, I go into this kind of practice a lot more in an episode. We've already filmed it for After Socrates, so there'll be more to say about this when that episode is released. But that's the basic idea. Now you can add one more dimension to it, and this is based on work on overcoming hyperbolic discounting. Jordan Peterson has something analogous to this. You can also do the reverse journaling. You can foresee the best possible life you'd like to be in, and also the worst way in which your life can go, and then write backwards from that event to now. Try to create a plausible story between that future event and the present, both of them. And it opens up the possibility of you seeing the difference between them, and that can also help you um, embed these memories of waking up to your Buddha nature, your inner sage, your inner teacher, and see how they may align with your future narrative. So those are practices you can do for journaling to water your Buddha.
You mentioned not beating yourself up. I just wanted to draw attention to a phrase I've heard you use that I really like, intelligent regret.
Yes, try to replace intelligent regret with a more primitive guilt response. Don't get rid of your guilt response and not replace it with anything. So guilt is basically you inflict pain on yourself, psychological pain, in order to alter your behavior. Typically, you don't do that with a friend. You don't inflict pain on your friend, alter their behavior. You try to explain to them what they've done. You help them to see how they've misframed things, mistaken things, and you try to point out how they could see it, and you try to encourage them. That's intelligent regret.
Claude asks, don't you think we can lie to ourselves? Because our self is not only one thing, but many different parts, and some parts can withhold and distort information in their communication with other parts.
Yeah, I mean, that is landing with me more powerfully than it would have because I've been doing a lot of work on the dialogical self. Um, and but I'm not, and it is the case that different parts of the brain do have access to information that other parts don't have. Um, it's still difficult to know how they would present propositions to each other uh, that wouldn't give access. What do I mean by that? So there's one thing in that. Suppose what you might be proposing, and I'm worried that I might be presumptuous here, that one part has knowledge of the world that another part doesn't have. And then the one part withholds that information from the other part. And then the question always becomes, where is the self? And in the dialogical model of the self is exactly the dialogue that emerges between the parts. And so that information can't actually be hidden to the dialogue. It can be hidden to one of the members of the dialogue, but it can't be hidden to the dialogue itself. And in that sense, you can't lie to yourself. I think the point you're making is an excellent point about the way in which different parts, especially within the dialogical model of the self, have access to different kinds of information, which is precisely, plausibly, why we talk to ourselves. But again, you need, and I agree with, if you replace the monological notion of the self with a dialogical notion, you still need to locate the self somewhere. And if it is the dialogue, then there's a sense in which the dialogue, precisely because it is a dialogue, does have access to the information. Um, it's a bit of a tricky line, I admit, and I think that's an excellent question. I think the point I'm making is still correct. You can't lie to yourself. But I like the question, especially about how it allows bullshitting to interact with how parts can withhold information from each other. It comes close to something like one part lying to the other. Uh, the the where I resist going all that way is you don't want to fully. Uh, this gets into a long discussion. You don't want to make each one of these parts a complete agent unto itself, because then you just have the problem that that agent then must have parts, and then all the inner agents must have parts, and you have an infinite regress. If you get to a place in which parts are not complete agents, and why not start at the first set of parts? And so that's again why I'm holding off. So for two reasons, I think you locate the self in the dialogue, and the dialogue is having access to both sides in some sense. And secondly, I don't want to attribute a full-blown intentional agency to the parts, um, the, because then you get into sort of an infinite regress problem.
Hello, Chaos. Oh, sorry. I
Great
thought you
question.
were. Okay, great.
Oh, I'm done, but I thought that was an excellent question. I really like that one.
Thank you, Cloud. Hello, Chaos. If you see an insect or spider in your house, you gently bring it outside, kill it, or let it be as it is. And is it ethical to kill a dying insect that seems to be suffering, or is that taking yourself for God? What is the ethics of putting someone out of his misery?
Yeah, yeah. I've wrestled with this at points in my life. Um, so first of all, if you think there are levels of agency, which I've argued for, and I'm not going to repeat all those arguments now, and your ethical obligations have to be proportional to the degree of agency, mindedness, cognition. So that's, for example, why I don't eat mammals, because I think they have a reflective capacity that plants don't have, or certain other fish don't have, etc. Um, so, and it's also why I think if we could create silicon sages, we have no moral argument against making them, even if they were to displace us. Um, the argument is that if we think creatures so-called lower than us, um, right, do not have as much inherent worth as we do, then of course by parity of argument, beings that are morally superior to us have more moral worth. And I don't think there's any way of that without being inconsistent. That being said, and I do try to be consistent on that, I think you have to take into effect, or you have to take into consideration, sorry, the effect you're having on plausible and probable organisms involved in the network of this particular organism. um, so, for example, even though in some sense trees are not our kind of agent, destroying an entire rainforest is a moral evil because of the impact on all of the of all of the beings in it, especially the mammals, and especially impact on human beings, etc. Whereas killing one dandelion doesn't seem to have any kind of significant consequence. Not that you should do it haphazardly, because it's a living thing. And if you believe, as I do, that a universe with living things in it is a better universe than uh, a universe without living things in it, then you have to take that into consideration. Killing an insect that's dying, I think that is a justified act because living things should be spared pain, uh, just like cognitive things should be spared psychological pain and meaninglessness. Um, so there's a big difference, for example, between killing an insect because it's dying and torturing an insect, which I think is morally reprehensible. Even an insect, I think torturing it is morally reprehensible. Um, there was a scene in the original Wicker Man movie. The new one with Nicolas Cage is a piece of trash. Don't watch it. But the old one is a masterpiece, and a child is actually torturing a fly, and you can feel something abhorrent about that, even though it's a housefly, and we kill them pretty readily. Houseflies, I've already said, I think torturing them would be abhorrent. But if a housefly is in my dwelling, I will kill it because they bring disease, and they have the potential of making me sick, or even, God forbid, killing me or my son. And if it's them or me in terms of moral comparison, I think they have to die. If I could persuade them to not be carriers of disease, of course, I would recommend that. But since that is not open to me, um, that's that I will kill them. By contrast, I will prevent people from killing spiders, even in my house, because I think spiders um, help to keep everything in my house uh, healthy, and therefore I can't justify killing them. In fact, I try to protect them. Same thing with centipedes. I know centipedes are ugly and they terrify us, but centipedes are really, really good for maintaining health of your sort of the hidden ecology of your dwelling. Um, so I'm trying to recommend. I'm not claiming that I follow any of this perfectly. I'm trying to recommend, ratio religio, a right proportioning of how you are connected to these things, right proportioning of your concern for their moral status, um, and coming up with general guidelines, but also case by case decisions about what you should do under these circumstances. I hope that was a helpful answer.
Clark asks, who's going to pack the boxes? Who's going to wash the toilets? How are we going to split this work that no one wants to do? How can the religion that is not a religion address this fundamental problem?
Um, so I was really privileged. I was at the Responder Street in Vermont to stay in the Maple Monastic Academy, and that academy functions perfectly. People there are pursuing enlightenment. They're doing meditation and chanting and all kinds of other practice. They also see and volunteer. And while I was there and the other teachers, we did the same. We volunteer to sweep the floors, wash the dishes, etc. And everybody does that. And there was no problem there. And this place has been running for a very long time, very successfully. Um, so suppose what might be, but what could be said back to me on that is, but how does that scale up? Um, Presumably, we would have people living in communities that were like that monastic academy. Sorry, I'm just following this. I'm dealing with implications unrolling as I'm speaking. we would have that kind of situation in which people would see this kind what to call it, this menial work as an integral part of the practice um, in itself, and that it also was community building, which is also important for the practice. And then could we properly scale that? And that's something where, like, Jordan Hall's notion of a civium is needed, where we need to think again about people living physically in much smaller communities closer to the Dunbar number, while they participate, of course, sophisticated, complex, even global enterprises virtually, and thereby we can get the best of both worlds. So it's possible within something like the monastic academy setup. There's been long-standing traditions of that, and then it's possible we could scale that up to a civilization scale with something like Jordan's notion of civium.
Mark asks, what is the hardest thing for you to do in your daily life?
Different kinds of hard. I mean, there's hard in just the sense of, properly scheduling my time so I don't burn out, but I don't drop the ball on things. That's hard. I'm not particularly good at that, so that's hard. I suppose maybe the hardest thing for me is psychologically hardest thing for me is wrestling with how to stay appropriately centered as I'm doing all of these various things, and not vacillate the way that's tearing on my psyche in inflation and sort of self-deprecation. Um, and I find that something that um, I wrestle with, because desire for unearned attention, of course, was in some sense bred into me by a fundamentalist Christianity, but it also bred into me a sadistic superego that punishes me for anything I accomplish. Then that is all balanced with a rejection of that whole framework, trying to replace it with Socratic framework of reflection and intelligent regret, dialogical interaction, epistemic humility, but intellectual courage. Um, and so those, those echoes, um, they can still, like, especially if I've had a period of sort of a string of successes, uh, I sort of any sort of fair measure. I often suffer after that quite deeply, um, and it sounds like, oh, what a first world problem. Oh, poor John. But I'm trying to just answer the question. It's like it's a part of me, like I said, that goes back to my upbringing, that makes me feel bad, put it as concretely as I can, about that. But if I'm not succeeding, there is another part of me that equally makes me feel quite bad. And that would be easy, would be to careen impulsively between those and let my psyche and my life and the lives that my life touches be ripped apart by that volatility, that ongoing vacillation. And you can see that in other people, and see that in other people, especially some family members. So the hard thing is to prevent vacillation, without it being a secret way in which inflation or arrogance creeps in. That's probably the hardest thing for me on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks. Richard, you have a question for John.
Yes, I do. Let me pull it up. I'm just going to read it if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
John, in your conversation with Lex Friedman, you began to argue why a unified explanation of both the nature and function of consciousness is necessary, and that to
Yes.
explain those things separately is incoherent. Both of you moved to other fruitful topics before you could make that argument in full. Therefore, could you do so here, specifically with an eye towards why hyperobjects, specifically ones built or composed of humans, one which Peugeot or Marceau may intuit and perhaps argue in fact have consciousness, do not in fact
Mhm.
have consciousness.
Right, right. I don't know if I can do the argument in full. I can point you to the series Untangling the World Knot that I did with Greg Enriquez, where that argument is in full.
Okay.
Um, and so, I mean, the argument has to do with the fact that, for example, the only argument that's given in the literature for why people are only tackling one question rather than both together is that it's easier, which of course carries no epistemic weight at all. Like, well, why are you climbing that tree to get to the moon? Because it's easier than building a rocket. Well, yeah, but it might be completely the wrong way. I mean, you need more than ease to justify. Then, if you think about it, it's very hard to talk about how something functions without understanding some of its fundamental properties, its nature. When you try and understand what something's nature is, you need an account of how it acts, of how it interacts with other things. So that's the sort of the core of the argument. Of course, the more extended way of making the argument is to show how theories that only address one or the other uh, often fall into some very significant problems, like the way the global workspace theory, which deals with function and without nature, some very difficult problems, or the integrated information theory, which deals with nature and not function, it's some very difficult problems, and that what would be recommended is integrating them together. Now, I actually can now strengthen that argument in that people have been publishing recently. There's been at least one, because I taught about it um, earlier this year, a specific attempt to integrate those two theories together precisely because of the complementarity of their weaknesses. So again, Richard, that's a bit of a gist, but you can. That's how the argument basically unfolds. And like I say, there's more and more people who are demonstrating by their attempts to integrate these complementary theories together are I think, providing additional plausibility for the argument I'm making. What does that have to do with the hyper objects or the hyper agents? I want to note one thing. Jonathan has explicitly in one of our discussions, not the one I had with him and Jordan, but the one he and I had with David Fuller, but one he and I had before that, the real possibility that the hyper agents don't possess
Yes.
consciousness,
Yeah.
and 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 so he gave ground on that side. I gave ground on the other side, which, and I just want to be clear about the argument. The argument I made is not an in principle argument. It's not in principle impossible hyperagents could have consciousness. Instead, I'm making a probabilistic argument about the kind of functional, I've already said function and nature are bound together, the kind of functional organization that seems to be needed in order to have uncontroversial existence of consciousness. like us and animals. And this has to do with the dynamics, the complexity, the bandwidth, the speed of transmission of information. Now, if we could get the complexification between people, speed up the transmission of information, include all kinds of information other than the propositional, have huge bandwidth for that, and have dynamics by which it is recursively doing relevance realization, I think that hyperagent could very well have consciousness. And so I, I've always been consistent about that. I'm not saying they can't in principle have it. I'm saying that they do not have evidence of the required functionality that we see in the organisms that uncontroversially do have it. And so him giving ground and me giving ground, I don't know if there's too much. If there's too much now separating us, he and I.
No, I don't think so. The only thing I would further ask is where can I find an argument, or maybe not an argument, but an explanation of why those qualities constitute consciousness? Is that in your Untangling the World Not
That's not.
series, or is it elsewhere?
Oh no, no. I mean, we didn't talk about it in Untangling World or Not. No, that's in the argument that people for extended mind have like Chalmers and Clark as to why they think the extended mind does not have consciousness. That's actually their argument. There's a similar argument made by Tollefson and others who talk about, we agency as to, again, why it's probable that the we agent does not have conscious experience. The arguments are not mine. They are actually arguments made by, on one hand, like I said, Chalmers and Clark, and by Tollefson when he or she, I can't remember, is talking about we agency. If you take a look in the papers that Dan Chiappa and I published on the robots, we cite the Tollefson work in the papers, and you can
Okay.
track that. Also, pay
Okay.
attention to the original arguments by Clark and Chalmers as to why they think extended cognition does not have extended consciousness.
Right, and that Chalmers and Clark paper should come right up if I look for their names. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you, Richard. Alexandra,
Thank you.
Alexandra, you have a question for John.
Hey John, how you going?
Good. Alexandra, I appreciated what you sent me. I haven't had a chance to review it yet. I took the long
No, I'm
weekend
sure.
off, and then today was the beginning of everything. I was a very busy day as UFT started
Yeah,
again today.
yeah. I'm heading towards exams. We're out of sync.
Yeah.
Um, I have actually got an academic kind of question for you. Can I just set it up a little bit? So I'm heading into my honors year in psychological science, and I've hooked up with a potential supervisor who is doing some great work on insights and um, semantic priming and that kind of stuff. And he's very much in the Friston world, um,
Yes. What's his
entropic
name?
brain. His name's Ruben Laukkanen. He's
Yeah, yeah,
very
yeah,
lovely
yeah, yeah,
man.
yeah.
You know
He's a
Ruben?
good guy.
Yeah, he's awesome,
I,
awesome. So I'm
I
really
know him
hoping to
in.
be able to work with him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's good. He's good. I don't know him. I
So,
know of him. He's
oh,
talked to my RA, and my RA has talked to we've had a
yeah, he's
conversation
younger.
with my RA.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. So, so what I'm seeing here in Australia is like people are pretty much on the predictive processing bandwagon, right? Like we've
Yeah.
got Jakob Howie down here in Melbourne, Chris Letherby over in Western Australia. You know, some prominent voices, and Mark Miller's down here now too. Um,
Not for
and
long. He's coming
not
to
for
Toronto.
long. You're gonna
Yeah.
snaffle him back, are you?
You bet. You bet I am.
Yeah, he's the best. Hey, um, so you know, I think there's a pretty global trend towards that being the main kind of thrust in this work, and And then I'm reading, Evan Thompson's recent, his crew's recent offering affect-based attention, and his counter arguments for why predictive processing isn't going to give us complete pictures. And then I hear that paper started a Twitter storm, and it's pretty controversial. It seems like Evan Thompson and his lot are thinking that we're coming to a fork in the road, and yet your recent paper with Brett Anderson is trying to make synthesis, trying
Yeah. Yep.
to try and align those.
The end.
So I'm wondering, like,
Oh,
personally, what was there a point in your career that put you on the 4E path, or was it like, for me it's kind of almost an aesthetic choice, but I'm feeling like there is a choice that has to be made, and I don't know, it's
so,
confusing me.
so let's respond to the academic backdrop and then to your specific issue. One of the points of the triple RPP paper is that the
Mm-hmm.
two theories need each other. Predictive processing needs recursive relevance realization because recursive relevance realization plugs it into phenomenology and plugs
Yeah.
it into autopoiesis in the way in which
Mm-hmm.
standard predictive processing doesn't. I think, in fact, the integration of PP with triple R, recursive relevance realization, provides a framework by which to answer what Evan has to say, because
Right.
he's ultimately saying, look, it's missing autopoiesis and it's missing the
Yep.
grounding in adaptivity. That's right, but if you integrate PP with RR, right, then that argument basically, I think, disappears. So
Uh-huh.
I know I'm sounding like I'm being self-promotional, but I think
No,
there's
no,
a
no.
reason why this paper is important, precisely
Mm,
because I think it transcends the debate in an important way.
right. Yeah.
Now, for the personal question, yeah, the moment me is when I realized at the end of writing my PhD thesis that standard Cartesian computationalism is completely incapable of dealing with relevance realization and the frame problem. That's what turned me. Evan was
Yeah.
around and he was influencing me, but when that happened, I realized, nope, that's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. I think Evan is trying to make the same kind of move, predictive processing, and I hold Evan in extremely high regard, as you know. I do think EP integrated with triple R and actually address a lot of the concerns. And so I think,
I mean, one of
go
my main
ahead.
problems is that I'm really mathematically illiterate, illiterate. Like, I didn't even do senior maths in high school, and I'm going to have to put a hell of a lot of work into to getting my head around that. But it seems like even mathematician friends of mine don't grasp Fristen's maths fully, and yet
And
people,
yeah,
like,
I like depends how you're doing this. I mean, really don't need to know the math deeply if you want to do the philosophical and psychological aspects of it. Math
mm,
is almost always after the fact, after the fact of doing a lot of the important theoretical work. And I think, and this is another point, by the way, for the triple RPP paper, we didn't dump a ton of math in there. We actually tried to provide an empirical grounding the theoretical claims directly, which is again to trying to model people where we think people where the research should be going. We've had enough of these, really complex mathematical models. Invaluable. They have proven that this approach and the whole dynamical approach can be mathematically rigorous. But that is not where the theoretical work is being done. And I've said this to Mark directly and to Brett. I'll say it to Carl if I ever get to talk to him directly. math, the Bayesian stuff is not, to my mind, where most of the important work is being done, because everybody admits that you can't apply the Bayes stuff directly, but only approximations, and then because of combinatorial explosion. And then how are the approximations implemented? Well, they're implemented by these recursive networks that are multi-layered and dynamically. So all this recursivity and dynamical self-organization is doing a lot of the work that has not been properly theorized. That's again
Right.
another advantage of connecting predictive processing with relevance realization, because relevance realization attempts to explain the kind of self-organization and how it may be functioning.
That's 100%. Yep. So
Oh,
I'm hopeful that there will be
sorry,
contributions
Alexander. We're
to.
gonna have to move
Yeah,
on.
you better go. Yeah,
Thank you so
thanks
much.
so much, John. That was awesome.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for sending me the stuff you did to me. I really appreciate it.
Great. Bye.
Bye.
Pat asks, in Plato's Republic, what is your take on the connection Plato makes between the tripartite psyche and the polis? And how does Plato's conception of the polis relate to our modern notion of politics, culture, and worldview?
Yeah. Who asked that question, by the way?
Pat, who's here listening. And you're welcome to come up, Pat. I sent you an invite.
You just didn't say the name. I just didn't hear the name of the
Oh,
person.
sorry. Oh, you can go. You can go ahead. Did you hear the question, John?
I heard the question. I just didn't know the name of the person who asked it.
Oh yeah, it's Pat.
That's all. That's all I
Yeah.
wanted to hear. I like to know the name of the person when I'm answering the question. So, I mean, oh wow, going through a lot right now, and even more recently in preparation for After Socrates, Kirkland's book on the ontology of Socratic questioning, and then of course Drew Hyland. Drew Hyland's all of his books, the one on the Charmides, the one on Plato on the question of beauty, just astonishing. But the Finitude and Transcendence book, which I think is brilliant, um, gave me, think, and I've gone back and forth on this over the years. For me, the convincing argument um, that that Plato understood the proposal of the city to be an anti-utopia. The city could not actually be realized, and we should not try and realize it. And when you go through all the textual clues around this, it's like, oh my gosh, it's pretty powerful. And then that fits with the whole argument that Drew Hyland makes, that Plato's always trying to get us to stand within finite transcendence. If we just identified with our finitude, we would find ourselves to just be, we would just submit to authority and fate. And if we just identified with our transcendence, we would think of ourselves as Gnostic gods and be subject to hubris. And the point is, and I think this is why the Greeks had always had both heroics and hubristic mythology. The point is to always do opponent processing between them. So the point of the Republic is not to propose a utopia, but is to try and come up with the best possible system and then realize why it still wouldn't function. That mean that the proposal was in vain? No, the point of the proposal of the city is exactly, and here's where we circle around, what Socrates proposes it to be. It's a way of blowing up the question of justice, uh, that we can see it on a scale that is not at least intuitively available to us when we look within the psyche. Then once we have realized it in this, what he calls the city in speech, to use some of my language, the city is to be understood imaginally. You're supposed to see through it back into the psyche in order to be able to magnify and become aware of, sensitize ourselves to different currents of thought, affect, arousal, energy, feeling in the psyche. And so I think that And so I strongly recommend reading Finitude and Transcendence, especially the chapter where Highland talks about this, because I think he makes an excellent case for it. So I've come to the conclusion, based on that argument and based on other work and based on the stuff that D.C. Schindler's talking about and Kirkland and a whole bunch of other people, that the polis that is being considered in the Republic is properly understood as imaginal in nature, not as a plan for constructing a city, nor is it mere ornamental imagery that can be disposed of. It is an imaginal practice so that we can properly reflect and get more perspicacious and acute awareness of the internal world of the psyche as it seeks for justice. Um, and of course, we already know that Plato thinks. So within that realm, we will never come to anything like perfect completion. We will never have wisdom because that only belongs to the gods. But we can, of course, get much better at loving wisdom. And so that is my answer about how I think we should understand Plato's use of the Cydian speech in the Republic. And I strongly recommend reading uh, reading Hyland's Finitude and Transcendence. And there's also, like I say, converging argument from Kirkland in his book on the ontology of Socratic questioning.
Matt, you have a question for John.
Yeah. So in your talk with Lex Friedman, you mentioned you were talking about myth and how not all myths are hero myths. Some myths are about patterns of hubris.
Yes.
And you mentioned some myths are about noticing the patterns themselves. And if I so this is a fairly easy question, because if I Google myths about patterns, nothing's really coming up. So I was just wondering if you could just give some examples that I could go and read myself.
In the beginning, when God was creating the heavens and the earth, the Spirit of the Lord hovered above the waters, and then God spake, "Let there be light." It's a myth about emergence, intelligibility. That's what it's about. It's a myth about religio itself, which of course is why it's God speaking at the origin of the world, and his spirit is hovering over primordial chaos. That's what it's about. It's not about a hero, it's not about hubris. It's about mythos, about religio, about intelligibility. There's another one. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. That's also, it's no coincidence that they start the same way because they're meant to be read side by side. That is also a myth about intelligibility, about the emergence of intelligible realness, how it's bound up with the Logos within, relevance realization, and the Logos without. Those are the kind of myths I had in mind. As I said when I was talking to Lex, I prefer mythos because by myth I don't mean a widely believed falsity. I believe I'm intending something that has a capacity for the deep disclosure of deep truths. And so by calling those passages from the Bible mythos, I am not, to my mind, in any way insulting them.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I view myth and mythos as synonyms the same way you kind of describe it. So I wasn't intending to say any different, but yeah, thank you.
And I didn't think you were. I just wanted to make clear what I was saying. But that would be my answer, Matt. Those kinds, and you can feel that those are myths at a different order, right? They're world-founding myths in some important way, which are different than myths about heroes and hubris.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, John.
Welcome.
John, do you have time for two more?
How about we split the difference? One more.
Okay. Prathamesh asks, "Hey John, what are your thoughts on Advaita Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism?"
Yeah. So my thoughts on it are that I'm not completely ignorant because I have read some Vedanta, and I've also read, in conjunction with that, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, read them more than once. Read about Vedanta. Did yoga for a couple of years to try and get a sense of what that means, um, and um, but and I've also read some stuff about Shaivism and then how it overlaps, especially in Kashmir, with Tantra and some tantric practices. And but really, all of that, I'm ignorant. Um, I and it's funny because Vedanta was one of the first things that attracted me out of fundamentalist Christianity. Um, I I want to know. I want to really understand Sankara better. I've got some books. I want to read it, and I want to get into Sankara the way I get into Socrates, uh, Siddhartha, and Spinoza. But it's an aspiration rather than anything where I can claim to have developed any deep appreciation. My only answer would be very intuitive. I intuit. I think there's an intimation that there's something of value for both myself and my work in that avenue, and I hope to have the time to be able to dive deeply into. I'm going to take Sankara as a representative of Vedanta, as the brilliant representative of it, and to really, really understand it. And like I say, I've done some practices, overlaps with it, so I'll have a bit of a taste. Of course, non-dualism. I have. Many people have made comparisons between Neoplatonism and Sankara. Also, people have made comparisons between Sankara and Spinoza. So I have some relevant stuff I can triangulate on. Uh, but it is. I'll have to ask this question from my future self because my current self is not properly educated to give it any kind of answer other than a promissory one.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. We always appreciate your time and your deeply thoughtful answers, and thank you so much, everyone, for the amazing questions as always. And we really appreciate you being here. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Take care, John.